We're going to be talking about creating great virtual presentations and some tips for doing so. And I found this quote that I thought was, to me, pretty inspiring. We often look at technology these days, especially those of us who try to live a more spiritual life and see technology sometimes as the bad guy, we're fighting against in a certain way. And I've noticed also that people with very strong spiritual energies do seem to have more challenges with technology. I've been at conferences where lights went out and crazy stuff has happened, and I haven't experienced those in other situations. So personal experience tells me that I have no evidence of that besides my personal perspective. But technology is the campfire around which we tell our stories. I think that's a great quote, and it's a different perspective on technology. And it's really how we're talking about using it for presentations, telling our story, our message, spreading the messages to others so that it can go forward. So thought it was a little inspiration to get us started here. So what we'll be covering in this presentation are, I guess you could call it the technical elements of a virtual presentation, which include your environment, your lighting, your camera, audio presentation, and then some factors to consider if you're doing it live, and then what you need to think about as far as next steps beyond just doing the presentation. So let's start this out with a little bit of interactivity. So tell me what you think. Out of these 5 kind of technical elements, which one do you think is the most important? And you can just keep the answer to yourself. We'll call it a self-assessment. So I'll give you a second to think about each one of these: your environment, your lighting, your camera setup, your audio, or your presentation itself. All right, hoping you have your answer by now. We're going to go. The answer is audio. So studies have shown that if the video quality is terrible, in fact, it can be completely static, people will stay tuned in as long as the audio is clear. But if the video is clear and the audio is statically, they leave much quicker. So when you're thinking about your virtual presentation, try to give a lot of thought to what the audio is going to sound like. And we'll talk about some ways to do that as we go forward, but that's a key element that is kind of counterintuitive when you're thinking of a visual video presentation. All right, so the first element we're going to talk about is your environment. So when we talk about your environment, it's basically where you're going to be when you give your presentation. And in general, it should be quiet, should be clean, and comfortable. And quiet, I think, is obvious based on our poll result, but the clean part is because it helps you focus on your content, and also if it's a part of your environment that's actually in the video, it can be distracting to your viewers if it's messy. And then comfortable, of course, it needs to be somewhere you're comfortable, talking out loud and being heard. So you don't want to, quiet and clean might be a coffee shop, but you wouldn't be comfortable giving a presentation in that setting. So one of the tips for each of these, I try to come up with about 4 ideas to think about. So in your environment, think of it as staging. If you're familiar with real estate, when someone goes to sell a house, especially high-end homes, they do staging, which means they set it up so that it looks appealing and it looks somewhat lived in, but it doesn't look cluttered. So you basically when you're staging a home, you do just enough decorating to make it look like I could step into this and live in this environment, but there's still space for me to do my own decorating. I use that as a visual reference for myself, but in general, you're just wanting to clean your desk, just so you have, you're not distracted yourself. And then anything in the background, you want to try to move out that might be distracting to people. So what you may, if you can see my camera, I did have a small monitor over here that I moved out of the way. You can kind of still see the stand, but moved that out of the way. And then we actually had some Mickey ears hanging on the wall behind me. And I took those down and put my ADL stole just because it was, the topic, it was the group we were meeting with. So little minor stuff like that can can really help make your presentation a little bit more cohesive. So notice the light sources. If you have a window and you're doing your presentation during the day, natural light is almost always the best source of light. So if you can face a window and have that natural light your face, that's ideal. But if you don't have that, or if you're giving it at night like we're doing now, I actually have a big window behind me, and then during the day it could be a challenge. So I actually had to buy 2 lights to counteract the brightness behind me. But notice the light sources. If you only have an overhead light, you might want to, and you don't necessarily have to buy anything, you can use lamps that are in your house, and just pay attention when you're looking at your environment where the light is coming from. And when we talk about lighting, we'll talk about how to correct some of those things. And then likewise, listen to the sounds. Just sit still and listen to any sounds that you may not normally notice. The AC, the rumble of the AC, you know, a fan running, the ticking of a clock somewhere. Those things, you sit in that environment probably pretty frequently, and so there might be things that you're used to ignoring, but somebody coming into your presentation is not used to in that environment, and it can be distracting for them. So just notice those in your environment so that you can plan for them. And then if you live with others, ask them to help you with accommodations for your presentation. So if you have pets that might be rowdy, ask your roommate or your spouse or significant other to maybe take them for a walk while you're doing your presentation, or likewise with kids, get them entertained. Or if you're doing something live and you need internet, asking them not to use the internet while you're doing your presentation. Those sorts of things can really make a big difference in both your quality of presentation, but also your stress levels. So quick summary on our environmental tips. Staging, just mainly the main focus here is what's in the video. Try to clean that up a little bit so it's not distracting. Pay attention to your light sources, which can include computer display. So if you might notice, my left side's a little bit brighter or a little different color than the rest of me, and that's because that's where my presentation's coming from, is my left side. And so that's a light source that is affecting the colors and all that. But again, listen to the sounds and then ask others to accommodate to help with some of these things. The next thing we'll talk about is lighting. And this image looks very complicated if you're not into video and media production. This is actually a fairly simple light setup, but for someone who's not familiar with this kind of thing, it can be very complicated. And but the things we want to think about here are the placements of your lights, how bright they are or not bright they are if they're very dim, and then the color of light. And that's something that, unless you're a designer, you probably haven't paid much attention to before, is the different color tones of lights, but it can make a big difference. So some tips for this, as a minimum, I would recommend using 2 lights. If you are doing your presentation during the day and you're using a window, if you're sitting right in front of the window, you're probably fine. You don't necessarily need another light. But if the window's to a side, then you probably want a light on the other side. Otherwise, your face is going to be half in shadow and half light. But if you're doing it at night or in another environment where you're not using natural light from a window, using 2 lights at an angle, like I said, I have 2, one on either side of my screens, so that I'm kind of more evenly lit in both sides. Match the color temperature of the lights. So daylight is more of a blue tone of light, and then your typical incandescent lights in the house tend to be a more warmer, oranger type of a color or yellow tone. So if you're using daylight for your window, coming through your window on this side, and then you got this really warm orange light, it's going to just look really weird. You're going to look blue on one side and kind of orange on the other, and someone's going to think your makeup artist is not so good. But just pay attention to it. If you're using home lamps, it's pretty inexpensive to just go buy a light bulb that's daylight color if you're using a window, or to buy two lamp color bulbs of the same color. Maybe if you can see my video, I'll just give an example. My lights are actually adjustable. So this is a blue tone, more of a daylight color. It gives a kind of a crisp look. And then this is more of a warm tone, and so it gives more of a softer tone. In general, I would lean towards the softer tone just because it feels a little bit more human and personable. With the blue light can kind of make you, I mean, I'm already pretty pale. I don't need to look any more pale. But when you have an option, go for the warmer lights in general. If you have bright lights, if that's your only source, is maybe like some kind of work light that's really bright, find a wall that you can bounce it off of, especially if you have a light color wall like a white or a tan color wall. I do that for some of my meetings. My laptop is actually I'm facing a wall when I do that. And instead of moving my lights and everything around when I do videos on there, I just turn one of my lights to face the wall, and then it bounces it and kind of fairly evenly covers me in a pretty soft light. And so that's another alternative. If you don't have multiple lights, maybe take one and just point it towards a wall and let it bounce back off the wall to soften it up a little. And then if you really have to in a pinch, you can just turn on the overhead lights. We have a light in this room, but I have it turned off at the moment. Typically overhead lights, you're going to get shadows on under your eyes and under your nose. And it's, it's just, I guess, I want to say less personable, but I guess that's not the word I'm looking for. But anyways, overhead lights just aren't as flattering. So if you have to, you can use those, but kind of consider those as a last resort in general, especially for fluorescent lights. They have a flicker that can be picked up in video that can be distracting. So lighting tips, try to use 2 lights from side angles. That also helps by not having a light right pointed in your face, having them off to the side. Try to match the color temperature and bounce the brighter lights, and consider your overhead lights as a last resort for an emergency. So camera. This is a fairly expensive, kind of complex camera. We don't need anything that complex for what we're doing for virtual presentations. Usually built-in webcams these days, depending on how old your computer is or phone is perfectly fine. You just want to make sure it's high definition. And when I say high definition, a minimum, I would say, of 720p. Anything below that looks like standard definition. And if you're doing live, most live streaming services only stream at 720 anyways. And so anything above that is kind of unnecessary. If you're doing a recording, you can go higher, but 720 is really the sweet spot as far as getting a decent quality and not having huge files or to stream or upload. You want to think of your framing. So you've probably all been on calls with people on Zoom where all you see is like the top of their head, like from the nose up. Or so when you're thinking of framing, and I guess I'm kind of skipping ahead into some of the tips, so we'll save that for the tips. And then adjustments. There are some adjustments you can do for your camera. So for instance, I'm using an app for this meeting. I'm not running Zoom directly through my camera. I'm actually running it through an app called XSplit. And what that allows me to do is I can actually control the blur on my background. So I made it a little bit blurry, just so I'm more of the focus in the video. So the background's less distracting. It's not an ego thing when we do those. It's really so that our students can focus on what the message is that we're delivering rather than getting distracted with something in the background. So let's go into it. Place the camera at eye level and include your head and shoulders. So if you have, like I have large screens, and for a while I had to put my webcam up on top, and everybody, then everybody's looking down. It feels like they're looking down at me. And then I put it below my monitor, and then it feels like I'm looking down at everyone else. And so either way, it's just an unnatural kind of perspective. And we want to try to replicate an in-person exchange as much as we can. And in general, even if we're tilting our head, if we're tilting our head down, they're tilting their head up, so we're still looking eye to eye. And so placing your camera eye level is a big thing as far as psychological connection and feeling more connected to the conversation and less focused thinking about, oh, this is virtual and this looks weird or whatever. So it's one less distraction. For instance, what I had to do to make this adjustment, I bought a gooseneck. If you're not familiar, they're kind of like these things you can bend. And I have my camera actually in the middle of my screen. So when I'm in meetings, I have to move the zoom around so that I can see everyone, but at least everyone else feels like I'm looking straight onto them for the most part. So you can make adaptations, and then I just move out of the way when I'm just working. Again, like I said, for your camera, you just want to make sure it's 720p or higher, and then typically around 30 frames per second if you want to get into that level of technical details. Generally, you don't have to worry about that. But if you're looking to buy a webcam or something, you want to make sure it does 720p or higher and at least 30 frames per second, which pretty much anything you buy these days will do that. Anything higher than that is kind of unnecessary unless you're doing exercises and you need to see a lot of motion. Anything below that, you might get a little bit choppy. You can go a little below that, but that's pretty much the standard. Resist using digital backgrounds. Dale, I do love your background. So this, and when you're doing meetings, it's fine. But when you're doing a presentation, a digital background can be distracting because, we know we're not fooling anybody of where we're at. And, if it's a movement kind of a background, it can be distracting. And if it's, a weird perspective, if it's a weird perspective that doesn't match your actual position, then it can be distracting. So I would say in general, resist it. If you're in a place where there is a very distracting background, it might be the better option to do a digital background. But in general, try to resist the urge, and it can be tempting. So, and then the last tip here is if you want to get some kind of fine control over your camera settings, there are apps, if you're using a webcam, there are apps, and some of them are free, that you can do some micro adjustment to the color tone of your video, blur the background, different things like that. If you're using a full-on camera like was in the photo, then you can do all those settings right on the camera. And I can't give you advice on that. You have to resort to your manual for that camera, but XSplit is a free software that I'm using, but there are tons of others out there for this kind of thing. So we talked about placing your camera at eye level, making sure you're including some of your body in that shot. Make sure the camera is 720p or higher with 30 frames per second. Resist the digital backgrounds. If you are planning to use a digital background, one thing might be a good tip from a business standpoint is to make it very simple, maybe just a white background and then have your logo off to the side. So it can be used if you're using it for branding purposes or something like that, but in general, avoid those when you can. And then if you need that fine control to make your camera look a little better, you can use some apps. All right, so audio. This is the one that we said was the most important. So here you got to think about, of course, your mic. What mic are you using? The volume is generally one of the main elements. And then environmental sounds. When we were talking about our environment, I said, just listen to the sounds that are coming into your environment. So this is where we'll make some accommodations for some of those. So as we said, audio is the most important element. So you definitely want to give some time and thought to that instead of just, using the first thing that comes up in your options when you're selecting a microphone. I would highly recommend using a quality external microphone. I have a USB condenser mic that I use when I record videos. For this, I'm actually using the built-in on my webcam just because it's not in the way of me. But there's all kinds of mics you can buy. You can get lapel mics that'll clip to your collar, and they're not that noticeable, so that's not a big deal. You can get a USB mic. There's Yeti mics are pretty popular for podcasting and things like that. There's what they call shotgun mics, which really like focus in on one area, so you can have a shotgun mic pointed right at your, if you're going to do it, probably at your around your chest area, picks up a more natural sound. But you can buy some pretty inexpensive mics on Amazon that will enhance the quality of your audio recording. That being said, it really depends on the device that you're using, because if you're using a modern like iPhone, for instance, and you're in a controlled environment where there's very little room noise, and you're fairly close to the phone, that actually is pretty good quality recordings. I've actually used those for voiceovers, for videos and things. So it really depends on your situation and how new and update your device is that you're using. But just pay attention to what mic. And I would just suggest recording something and then listening to it on some decent speakers just to see what the quality sounds like. So the things you want to think about is, of course, you want to make sure your voice is loud and clear. Of course, you don't want to be so loud that it's distorting and cutting off, but you don't want people to have to turn it up to hear you, and then when someone else speaks, it's like super loud in their ear. So just make sure your voice is at a normal level. That also applies to not just your mic settings, but also how you're talking and presenting. So think about that when you're presenting and practicing, is how are you projecting your voice. And then clarity, and the clarity is really focused more around the environmental noises. So adjust for environmental sound. So if you do have an AC sound, if your presentation is probably not more than an hour, maybe you can, crank it up, get it nice and chilly in the house, and then turn it off for the hour that you're doing your presentation. Vice versa with the heat, if you need to do it that way. Or there are some other things you can do. You can use pillows and things to dampen sounds that are distracting, or maybe change to a different room. So for the audio tips, main thing to remember is that is just the most important element. So make sure you're paying attention to the quality of the audio. Oh, I skipped over all those other ones. But we went through them pretty thoroughly, so I won't read them again. Presentation. So this is not just about slides, which I'm using, but everyone doesn't necessarily need slides for what they're doing. It's also about your appearance and the actual content of your presentation. So when we talk about presentation, we're kind of talking about all of those things. The most important thing I could say is prepare your energy prior to your presentation, whether it's just you doing a recorded presentation or if you're doing, especially if you're doing a live, make sure you spend some time beforehand. And I would recommend do it right before you start, is do something to get in your zone, just prepare your energy, both in the way that's suitable for you and the content of your message. You might not need, and when I say prepare your energy, I don't necessarily mean get super hyped and, really jazzed up. That might work for you depending on what your topic is and your audience, but just get your energy to where you really want it to be during your presentation. And as spiritual workers, I think we all have kind of our own methods, so I won't go into any of that. And we're familiar with this idea of working with our energy. So that's the main point I want to drive home for presentations here. The other thing is be mindful of your clothing colors and patterns. When you're doing something on video, small patterns can get really distorted and look really weird and trippy if you're moving, and just because of frame rates and different things like that. So I would recommend not wearing anything with really small patterns on it. And then color choice, you want to think about what your background is. If I was wearing like a black shirt, although this kind of looks black, it's actually a teal blue. Um, my body would kind of melt into the chair. You wouldn't really notice. I could have worn a lighter shirt, but vice versa. If you have a white background and you're wearing a white shirt, then either way you kind of look like just a bobbling head moving around. So just think about your color choice. Do you and go with what works for you. Sometimes the colors that we wear affects our energy. So think about what energy you want to have, and colors have psychological effects. And so if you're doing a presentation that's about business, maybe a light blue would be good. Or if you're doing one that's about romance, maybe a red or a purple would be good. But think about those things when you're thinking about your presentation. If you are using slides, make sure it's very clean and consistent. When different if every slide is a different color and a different font and all that, it can get really distracting and kind of hard to follow as a student. So try to use something that's very consistent. And there's a lot of research gone into slide presentations. They all recommend keeping words to a minimum. There's different numbers. Some say maximum of 6 words. The format I follow is essentially one idea per slide, one thought per slide. And it's okay to navigate away from that every once in a while. So like when I show the summary of tips, there's multiple ideas on there, but we've already gone through them one by one at that point. So that's the idea that I would suggest using, is when you're creating your slides, try to only put one idea on one slide. It's actually more engaging for you to flip through 3 slides in 10 seconds than it is to be sitting on one slide and talk about it for 30 minutes, because all of your content's on that one slide. So just break it up across slides. And when you do that, just use a consistent theme. The other thing on this is use large fonts, because especially people these days are viewing more and more videos and courses on their phones. And so on a small screen, tiny fonts can be hard to see. But essentially, you're just using the slide to be a visual reinforcement for whatever your message is. So you can keep it very simple. And then, we all heard the practice, and all these other cliches about practice. But what I have found is practicing, even if it's just mentally practicing, which I did with this presentation. I actually haven't gone through this whole presentation by clicking through it yet. I've gone through it several times in pieces in my mind. But by practicing your presentation, not only do you find things that you may have forgotten, or elements that you could add that would really add a lot of value to that, that specific section, but it allows you to be more flexible in your presentation, especially if you're doing something live. There's all kinds of things that can be distractions, but if you've practiced, you can easily come back, be distracted, go on a tangent, and then come back to your content with relative ease. So just make sure you're practicing, either physically practicing or at least visualizing it and going through it in your head. So here are the things we covered for presentation tips. So prepare your energy prior. Be mindful of the clothing you're wearing. Be mindful of your slide design. In general, just keep it as few words as possible. And then practice. All right, so we're down to the last 2 sections. That was all of the technical aspects. Well, I guess these are kind of technical too, but so this one we're going to talk in a little bit more about if you're doing it a live presentation. Kind of the main things to think about here is, of course, your internet connection. If you're in the middle of a presentation and internet goes out or gets choppy, that can be distracting. Engagement. You want to build in some engagement into your presentation, and then having a moderator when possible. So let's talk about some of that. The biggest one I would say is having someone be a moderator, especially if you're doing a larger group. If it's a small group like this, you probably be all right. But when you're having a larger meeting or presentation, having someone who can monitor chat and just keep track of what the questions were in the chat, because in general, that's where you want to encourage people to put their questions in the chat so you can come back to them. But having someone keeping track of that and maybe responding to some of the simple questions is very, very helpful, and so less stressful than trying to do all that yourself, because you're trying to think of your content and make sure you're telling them, what they need to hear. But then someone puts in a question in the chat and you're like, "Ooh, I got to do that real quick." And so anyways, just have a moderator when you can. And in Zoom, you can set them as a co-host. Depending on what platform you're using, there's ways you can do it. You don't even really have to set them as a co-host. You can just have somebody in there writing down the chats and then, message them to you. Test your internet connection prior. I thought about trying to do some like megabytes per second number, but then I realized, really the best way to do this is to just get in and load up your presentation and do it by yourself. You need to practice anyways. And so by doing it yourself, you can actually test your internet connection. The best way to see if your internet is strong enough for a video presentation is to just test it and do it. So maybe have a friend jump on with you just to see what it looks like on their end. And in the process, you can go through your presentation and practice, and maybe they can give you some feedback. So you're really covering a lot in one go. This is a big one that I've had to learn. I usually have tons of programs and about 20 tabs open in my browser at a time, and that's on a modest day. So closing your program, closing tabs, and then shutting off any other devices that might be using your internet that you're not really using. So like my laptop, I shut it off right before we got started. Things like that can really help things run smoother. And not only that, closing out programs also can turn off those notifications. And we're always getting notifications that can be distracting. And as a presenter, especially if you're sharing your screen and a notification pops up, depending on how you shared your screen, your audience might see that. And then, depending on what that is, that could be embarrassing. But yeah, closing those programs can help deal with those notifications as well. So plan points of engagement. So right off the bat, we jumped into a poll just to get your feedback, get you thinking. That's a technique I learned from someone who is a instructional design person. I don't know what their actual titles are, but it's a technique that they use in classrooms as well as online, because if you're just passively taking in information, it's not really sinking in as much. And so building in some points of engagement really helps the message sink in a little deeper. They're thinking about it and becomes a little bit more applicable to their life. I could have done a better job of that in this presentation, but it is what it is. So summary of the live factors. Have a moderator, test your connection, close programs and devices, and then plan some points of engagement. Some of the things I've read have said roughly every 7 to 10 minutes, you want to have something that is engaging your audience, whether it's asking them to put something in the chat, throwing up a poll question, just asking them to think about something can work. So just a reference point there. And the final section we will talk about is your next steps. So when your presentation is over, think about where your student or your attendee is. They came to your presentation for a purpose. They had an interest in it. And that interest, for someone who has a true interest, doesn't end when the presentation's over. They're going to go back to their life. And it's probably like you're feeling after watching this. It's a lot of information to take in at once. What do I do next is probably the most common question we have when we're learning anything new. And so think about that for them. You don't want them to have to figure that out on their own. So it should be something that's actionable, it's beneficial to them, and it could be something, depending on what your presentation is, it could be aligned with your processes. And I'll talk about what that means. So essentially what we're doing here is we're just telling them what to do next, which I'll give you a next step at the end of this presentation. But you're just telling them what they need to do next, and that can come from a lot of different ways. It can be, in general, what is the most beneficial thing that for them to do next. And you, as the teacher of the content, will generally have a better idea of some guidance on that than leaving them to their own devices to figure that out. So think about that as part of your presentation of what they would do after your presentation. And then if it's a presentation where you're thinking, you could get some people that might become clients or work with you in some way, what is the next step in that process? That could be your next step is, if you're interested in this and you want to work with me, click, go here to sign up for a free consultation, or sign up to my email list, or, whatever that next step is in your process. And in general, you want to have that set up in advance. And so that's why you want to think about it before your presentation. What is the next step that they need to take? And then if it's something that you can set up or need to set up, make sure you have that set up before your presentation so that it's ready. Because if somebody's really excited about your presentation, like, yeah, I'm ready to do that next thing, if it's not ready for them, then they, go off into life and get distracted with other things, and then they didn't benefit from that next step. So think about that and set it up in advance. So for next steps, you're just telling them what to do next, thinking about it in advance, and then setting it up so that it's ready for them. So let's just do a quick summary. These are the things we talked about. You want to prepare for these, the different key elements. And these elements kind of apply to both live and pre-recorded presentations. So your environment, your lighting, your camera, your audio, and then your presentation elements. And then the factors of a live presentation we talked about to take in consideration. And the last thing we talked about was preparing for the next steps for your students. So what is the next step? My recommendation for this is, even if you're not interested in having a course on the ADL website, this course is pretty helpful. It's still in development, so there'll be more stuff added, but there's a lot there right now. So we have this course in the ADL support section. If you go to support, oops, I put some Plero sites, but support.allianceofdivinelove.org. If you put, go there, support@allianceofdivinelove.org, you'll see under step-by-step tutorials, this is one of the courses available. So it's a course instructor guide and tutorial. And there's several lessons in there that'll walk you through coming up with an idea for a course. And when we say course, you can think of it as a presentation as well. So if you're thinking, if you want to give a presentation at a conference somewhere, this could still be helpful in coming up with topics for that. But it helps you everything from coming up with a topic and the format of a course to some templates for laying out your outline. This slide presentation was built from a template that I created for ADL, and it's in this course instructor guide. There's a link to it in there, so you can make a copy of it and just use that. So there's a lot of content in there, a lot of things that can help you with next steps depending on where you're at in your journey with virtual presentations. So again, that was support.allianceofdivinelove.org, which is correct on this screen. So if you have any questions, we'll take those now, but also you can email support@allianceofdivinelove.org at any time. And you can also find answers at the website at support.allianceofdivinelove.org. We have that course instructor guide But we also have a frequently asked questions section in the support website that you might find answers to other questions that you have as well.